الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن نبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we have reached the very end of the story of the Kholafaa. We started with Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, and finally Ali radiallahu anhum ajma'een. In today's class will be a little bit shorter. We will look back, reflect, highlight some of the lessons that we learned from the stories of these great men. In general, whenever we look at the lives of the people who came before us, the reason why we study these stories is because there is ibrah, is a lesson for the believers. When Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about the stories of the prophets alayhimu salam, Allah Azza wa Jal says, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, that verily in their story, in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and the story of the prophets in general, there is a lesson for those of intellect and understanding. Now, the stories of the Kholafaa is unique in the sense that it is well documented, and also it comes from people, lives of individuals who were not ma'soom in the same way that the prophets alayhimu salam were. The scholars have often asked the question, is there truly such a thing as a person that is completely ma'soom, meaning completely safe from sin, from shortcomings? And the answer, one of the best answers that the scholars have come with is that the only one that is ma'soom is the one whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects. Doesn't mean that the person won't make any mistakes, but it means that whenever a mistake is done or committed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there to correct that mistake, to guide that person. So by human nature, everyone makes a mistake. The Prophet ﷺ said, كُلُّ بَنِي آدَمَ خَطَّاءٌ وَخَيْرُ الْخَطَّائِينَ التَّوَّابُونَ, that every child of Adam will make a mistake. Even the Prophet ﷺ. But the difference here with the Prophet ﷺ is that the Prophet ﷺ, Allah Azza wa Jal guided him, sent down revelation, forgave him, لِيَغْفِرَ لَكَ اللَّهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنْبِكَ وَمَا تَأَخَّرَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave the Prophet ﷺ his past and future sins. Yet the companions were different because they were more, not to say that they were more human because all of them were human, but you will see in their actions that they would make mistakes. Some of the companions might have committed major mistakes in their life. Yet, their love for the Prophet ﷺ and their love for Allah and the religion would remain. So sometimes it might be easier for a person as a believer to relate to these companions of the Prophet ﷺ. If a person speaks about the Prophets ﷺ, then a person might say, oh, these are prophets, Allah guided them, they're special, they were chosen. But if you look at the story of someone like Salman al-Farisi, if you look at the story of someone like Abu Hurairah and the companions in general, it might be easier for a person to relate in terms of the life that they led. And who better to look at than the four companions who ended up taking on the mantle, the responsibility to continue in the footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ. And perhaps this might be the first and the biggest lesson, and we've touched on this in the past. And that lesson is, just because the Prophet ﷺ passed away, it did not mean that the religion came to an end. It did not mean that the companions just stopped and said, you know what, we did what we could, now the Prophet ﷺ is not here anymore, so, let's forget about it. No, they realized that this religion is bigger than any one individual. That the Prophet, this is why Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he made that famous statement to the people. He said, "O people, whoever used to worship Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they know that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has passed away. But whoever was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they know that Allah Hayyul La Yamut, that Allah Azza wa Jal is alive and will never die." And then they took on that responsibility together. When one would pass away, that responsibility was given to someone else. And it also shows us how well they were taught. The Prophet ﷺ only spent 23 years with them as a prophet. Yet, when he left them with great ambition, with great understanding. And if we reflect on that part, this is what we want as parents, just as an example. When we raise our children, we want our children and the next generation to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, whether we are there or we are elsewhere. And this is why it's important to teach in the right way. If you just instill fear, telling the person, the child, pray because I told you so, or if you tell your child, if you don't pray, you go to Jahannam. And this is the whole concept of praying that the child knows. When you are away, the child doesn't care, just sits and watches TV. But the moment you come into the house, the child drops the remote and runs and prays. This is not the healthy way to go about it. Why? Because the child is praying because you are there. The child is fasting because you are there. And the moment you are absent, we've seen it. Many youth, unfortunately, once they get a chance, the first chance or opportunity they get to stand on their own two legs, what happens? When they go to university somewhere else, when they live by themselves, no salah, no connection with the masjid in that new community, they forget all those things that they have been taught. So the lesson here, one of the many lessons, is we want to teach our children the same way that the Prophet ﷺ taught those companions. And it takes time. 23 years it took the Prophet ﷺ to teach these companions. And you'll see in the beginning, many of them stumbling, making mistakes. There's a well-known hadith of some of the companions when they became Muslim and they saw and they saw the mushrikun, those who associate partners with Allah, that they would do certain practices. They used to take their swords and they used to hang it on the tree, seeking barakah from the tree, blessing from the tree. And then they would go to the Prophet ﷺ and they would say, Ya Rasulullah, make for us a tree like they have a tree. And the Prophet ﷺ became upset because this was a serious matter. But the Prophet ﷺ would not lose hope in those companions. So we understand that it is a journey, it takes time, there's going to be issues that come up in between. Even the major companions, such as Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he would have conflict, he would have arguments with other companions. And the matter, the issue would be brought in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And sometimes Abu Bakr himself would utter statements, say words that were un-Islamic, bad words. Why? Because he's a human being. He makes mistakes. But once he remembered that this is not the way that a believer speaks, he felt great regret. Another lesson from amongst the many lessons is that even though, looking back in history, many people, they start judging and having difference of opinion, during the time, whenever a Khalifa, especially these four, whenever a Khalifa would stand up, they would whenever a Khalifa would stand up and become the Khalifa for the Muslims, the other Muslims around that person would work towards helping him. And it was not that the other companions would work in order to defeat him or to compete with him. And they saw the position of a Khalifa as a burden, as a responsibility, not as a title. Today, people, they actively run for these positions. And they say, I want to be this and I want to be that. But at the time of these companions at least, they would run away from that responsibility. You don't hear Abu Bakr saying, choose me. It was because the people realized who Abu Bakr was. And once Abu Bakr realized himself that he was the best fit for that responsibility, he took it upon himself. Similarly, Umar radiallahu anhu, he didn't go around saying, choose me, because this leadership or being in charge, it is something that brings a lot of responsibility. And if a person is not the right fit, then it becomes a sadness, like the Prophet ﷺ described to Abu Dharr in a hadith. It becomes a sadness for the person on the Day of Judgment. So, the lesson here, to put it simply, is that this leadership, the role of a leader, was understood by those companions, the severity of it, and they would not run towards it, but rather they would run away from it. And if anyone else could be the leader, then they would be happy with it. And once another leader was appointed, then the companions would rally behind that person and help them. When Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, Umar was right there next to him, helping him. When Umar became the Khalifa, Uthman was there next to him, helping him. When Uthman became the Khalifa, Ali radiallahu anhu was there next to him. And so on and so forth. So this help that they would give to each other was because they understood the reality that serving Islam and serving Muslims, it is not a privilege, rather it is an obligation, and it is a big responsibility. Now, another lesson, inshallah we'll keep it brief. If you look at what was achieved during those 40 years, around about 40 years that the first Kholafaa were in power, you will see that as long as the Muslims were united, they were moving forward. During the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, there was a short period of time where there was chaos and confusion. The Prophet ﷺ has just passed away, and people were leaving Islam, saying, we pledged allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ, now he is dead, so we don't have to fulfill the conditions in Islam. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq stood firm, and he united the Muslims. He was Khalifa only for 2 years. And when he handed it over to Umar, it was in the best condition possible for Umar to expand the Muslim world. And that expansion was very rapid. And it continued into the Kholafaa of Uthman. However, once Uthman radiallahu anhu was martyred, was killed, you will see that everything came to a halt. Everything stopped. Why? Because the Muslims themselves started having a conflict. And you see this today in many different ways around the Muslim world. Why are our own Muslim, the majority of our Muslim countries back home, in such a state? It's because, at least in my view, that Muslims, many Muslims, are very far away from the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. If you speak about corruption, some of the most corrupt countries are our own countries. If you speak about civil war, people fighting each other in the same country, many of our countries are the top countries. And so on and so forth. Yet the religion is what unites us. And like the scholars in Islam, they say it is never too late for people to come together, to rectify, to fix what has gone wrong. But in order to fix, you need to admit that there is a problem. And once you admit that there is a problem, you can address the problem and move forward. And I see that the problem for many of us is that we see and we look at others as the problem, when in reality the problem is within us. It is easy to point a finger and say the problem is because of this country or it's because of these individuals. But it is difficult to look within yourself and to say, maybe I had a hand in this. What did I do wrong? What could I have done more? And you'll see that the success of these companions lies often in this self-reflection. That Umar was the one that used to say, hold yourself accountable before you are held accountable. Hold yourself accountable before you are held accountable, meaning on the day of judgment. Look into your own actions. And this is who? This is Amir al-Mu'mineen Umar radiallahu anhu. He is the one who would go to Hudayfa radiallahu anhu and say, I don't want you to tell me about other people. Just let me know that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned me amongst the hypocrites. I don't care about what the Prophet ﷺ said about other people. But just tell me, am I amongst the hypocrites? And this is a man that was so close to the Prophet ﷺ. And he's so worried time and time again. He didn't go to Hudayfa saying, oh, what did the Prophet ﷺ say? What's the juicy story? Is Abu Bakr a hypocrite? Is Uthman a hypocrite? Let me know. No. What he cared about was himself. So, again, in short, the story of the Kholafaa, you can benefit in terms of a community. They went through the same struggles that many communities go through. When they get bigger, people have conflicts, people have difference of opinion. And also you can benefit from their stories on a personal level, individual level, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how they had to act, how they had to stand up for the truth, especially at a crucial time, like the time after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So inshallah, hopefully these stories of the Kholafaa is a story that we will inshallah hopefully revisit in the near future. It is a story that I would encourage you to share with your family, with your friends, to go over and to revisit these stories. Inshallah, we will stop here for today.